My name is Paul Eli. I'm a senior fellow in the Berkeley Center, an author and a person who worked for couple of decades in literary publishing. It's my pleasure to welcome here Irinse Ifekandu, and it's a pleasure, first of all, to see you again. We spent most of the day together in Brooklyn, what was it, 2 years ago?
Yeah, last year.
A very memorable day, and I was around some of the same places where we went just the day before last, and it all came flooding back. We're here, I'm happy to say, as part of Outtober at Georgetown, and also as part of the Faith and Culture series. And to all the different campus constituents who've put out word for this event and helped let people know that Irinse would be here, my gratitude, so thank you very much. I thought that we'd start with some conversation, and then I'd ask you to read something from the book. The book is God's Children Are Little Broken Things. This is a remarkable book of short stories published by Public Space Books last year. That's a Brooklyn-based publisher. Now, just to wind back a bit, you're from Nigeria, I'm from upstate New York. I was born in 1965, you were born in 1995. But I have to say, when I encounter your work, one of the first things that comes to mind is that we both went through this experience of an American MFA program. And for better or for worse, that's been part of my apprehension of the book, and I hope I can touch on that in conversation. Well, when I was in the MFA program at Columbia in the early 90s, some people were novelists and some people were short story writers. And the short story writers, of whom I was one, aspired to have a book of short stories. Most of us never made it. Most of us didn't even get close. But this is a true book of short stories, which in its amplitude, its variety, its return to certain themes, the recognizable voice and sensibility that keeps expanding and exfoliating in the course of the book. It's got the qualities of what I associate with many great books of short stories from the past. And I suppose that's where I'd like to start as I sit down. But first of all, let me just say again, welcome to Georgetown, Irinse.
Thank you, Paul.
My experience of your work is through these stories. You were educated in, I guess, an Episcopal school?
Yeah, so like I did my JSS1, which is like the first year of high school. I did it in an Anglican school, which is an Episcopal school, and then I finished like the rest of the 5 years of secondary school at a Catholic school. Yeah.
Were you already writing fiction or imaginative work at that time?
Yes. So I was 10 when I joined the Episcopal school. It was a boarding school, and I had like a number of friends with whom, prior to that, I was like telling stories to my siblings, which was what my mother used to do with us as well. And so like when I went to boarding school, I found friends with whom like I would sort of scribble little plays and notebooks and stuff. And so that's when like my literary like life began, so to speak, when it comes to stuff like writing. So yeah, that's like since secondary school, yeah.
And the short story form feels so natural in your handling of it. Is this length? I don't know what it is, about 6,000 words or something. You weren't doing that when you were 10, I don't imagine. But
No. So I discovered the short story pretty late. Maybe not so late, because I was, I think, in SS2 senior class at the time. Yeah, it was the beginning of SS2, and I had just read The Thing Around Your Neck. And I was like, oh, so it's like by Chimamanda, is this book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie? And I had never read a short story before. I had read novels, I had seen movies and all those things, but I had never read a short story. So I was quite surprised that something like that existed. And I remember writing my first short story right after reading it. Was a different something, I've forgotten the title. And I remember giving it to my friend's mother. She lived like a few houses from ours, like a few compounds from ours. She used to give me these like Daniel Steele novels, and like would sit down and talk about them together. And so I remember some of the words she said. She was like, oh, Irinse, like, you write beautifully for your age. And that was just like, some kind of encouragement. And like that was not just that. Like we sat down and she talked about the particulars of the story and even sort of the language, sort of the diction, in a very like fun way. So that was my first short story, and my first introduction into the short story as as a reader was The Thing Around Your Neck. And then I went on to university and I discovered Jhumpa Lahiri and I discovered Yiyun Lee, and yeah, and it's just been that.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has been a guest here at Georgetown twice, and does she know that you were hatched from her nest?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Purple Hibiscus, I think I've spoken more about that than the Thing Around Your Neck. So with Purple Hibiscus, yeah, she knows. Yeah.
And what about Jhumpa Lahiri? I teach her nonfiction book, In Other Words, about learning Italian in my first year course called The Search. But you probably read Interpreter of Maladies?
Yes, I did, Interpreter of Maladies. And then I read a bit of the second one. So when I was writing Where the Heart Sleeps, titled At Light Out Hour at the time, after like a line from a poem by Edwin Morgan, I had, that was when I read Unaccustomed Earth, and sort of that's long form and double, points of view. Like I think in one of the stories, like the point of view was switching between the father and the daughter, and I thought like that was well done. And so yeah, Interpreter of Maladies, and what I really loved about it was just like those little observations that were so interesting and real. And I think, in a way, even though I had never like traveled to sort of America, but I sort of understood that sense of like a lively place, because some of the stories are like sets. We've read Interpreter of Maladies, so like that was one of the books I loved.
So you had already written short stories that became part of your application to Iowa, or these stories predate the Iowa Writers Workshop, or they were written there or afterward?
A lot of them. So some of them predated. In fact, a lot of them did predate Iowa. But at Iowa, I rewrote some of them as well. I know that like What the Singers Say About Love I had written just before coming to Iowa. So it felt like there are certain periods, because the book started right after I had gone to Chimamanda's workshop, and I returned home. I was in my first year of university, so around like the age of 18. I remember they were calling me the baby of the workshop.
So she taught a workshop in
yeah. And so after that workshop, I left the other things I was doing, and I was like, I want to write a collection of stories, because I think I felt pretty challenged at that workshop. Although she was like full of praise for my stories, like I was like, I remember two people in my class who I was just like looking like this, and I was like, you people can write, so and I came out from the workshop and I was like, I need to go back and do something more, and so that's from where this book came out from.
Out of a sense that you had to rise to the level of these other people you were in the group with.
Yeah, but in a sense that like I felt like they inspired me. I remember one of them, like our final dinner. When I was sharing an anecdote, with them, like something like an encounter I had with a guy, and she was like, Arinze, you have a crush on this person. And it was so true, even though I was like, no, I don't. Like, but now looking at it in retrospect, I was like, yeah, I did have a crush on this person. And not just because, they were also like, pretty, they were quiet in terms of like their temperament, but then like when they wrote, like it was so beautiful, and like, and I was like, yeah, this is beautiful. And I guess it pushed me a little bit out of my comfort zone, and I began to sort of like yearn for more, yeah.
So the stories in different ways, and the difference is part of what's striking about the book. Gay or queer experience figures into most of the stories, and in a different way or with a different pressure or a different moment from story to story, so that it's very fluid and not programmatic. First of all, has queer experience always been part of your fiction, or was that something you brought in later?
Yeah, that was something I think it has always been, even when I used to tell my sibling stories, like the affection that characters had for each other were not like just, between men and women. But then when it came to sort of writing the stories. I did not write like stories like, queer stories, I guess, until I was maybe around the age of 13, 14. And I remember my first, if memory serves me correctly, my first like queer character was in a James Hadley Chase novel. It was just a James Hadley Chase novel, like my first encounter with a queer character in fiction.
You were 13 or 14, you said?
13 or 14, and like an uncle-in-law had that book, and I just like borrowed it and I was reading. It was a minor character, with all the intrigue and sort of the sort of sexiness of, that's associated with that book. But, it was like when I saw that character doing something that like, basically desiring another man, I was like, ooh, this is interesting. And I remember like writing an entire book right after reading it, like, about, these two guys who are in love, but like the relationship is kind of like, I don't know, it's not ideal, it's kind of abusive. One person is overly possessive. And it sort of employs a lot of sort of this intrigue that I encountered in that book. But then like the queerness was the subject, like the queerness, like the characters, I guess the main characters were queer. That was what I just did. And it was so much fun. And I remember sharing that book, like it would pass like from my peers, my friends would like read it like from person to person. But previously, like I had written a book which I had given to, this was like in secondary school, which I had given to my mom and my uncle, and like they loved. But that particular one, I did not give it to anybody. I was just like, anybody in my family, I only gave it to like my friends in school and my peers in church. And so like that's, I guess maybe that was the turning point. Yeah.
Either way, I'm surprised and even amazed. So you were writing about queer experience from the age of 13 or 14 at length. One book that you shared with lots of people, and the other that you only shared with people in church and in school.
Yeah.
But how does that, what is it like to share fiction you've written of that kind with people in church when you're 14 in Nigeria?
Firstly, like it had to be my peers, like
it wasn't the whole congregation.
Yeah, it had to be my peers. So the one I shared with like my mom and my uncle, the title of the book is A Human Pearl, about this girl who sort of is, I guess it's like virtue kind of literature where this person has kept her virginity in spite of great odds, and it's just, I guess I was trying to impress two people I liked a lot in my life, my mom and my uncle, her younger brother. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write something that I think they would enjoy, right? But everything I had, like it was kind of different from everything I had done before, in all the experiments I had been doing. And like so yeah, when I wrote the James Hadley Chase sort of imitation, I just knew instinctively that, of course, I would not show it to mom because they were like, it had like all the honeyness of my of that age. I was like, no, the only people who would appreciate this, even if they are like in church or in school, would be my peers, so my age mates and stuff.
It's understandable that you would hold back, I guess, from showing it to your mother. I was just thinking, and perhaps incorrectly or in a stereotyped way, my knowledge of Nigeria and sexuality comes from my friend Mark Gavisser's book, The Pink Line, which is about the status of gay people in different countries around the world. And his depiction of Nigeria suggests that things are pretty harsh there. But they were sufficiently open in your world that you could, that this has been part of your writing as long as you've been a writer?
Yeah, I guess like, it's just like recently that sometimes I'm not, I have always, recently I feel, oh yeah, I know, of course, as I get older that there's like discrimination and there's like danger from place to place. But I have always wanted to like enjoy life, and part of that enjoyment is to write what truly satisfies me, and to share it with people who would appreciate it. And so like even when like I was even when I was sharing like stories with friends in different contexts, like I was not always sure of what was going to happen, but what was sure was something like an instinct in me that was like, once like there was like, I'll just hear a little, something little that the person would say that I feel, oh, this is maybe someone would say, oh, why are you writing about like these two boys? And then they, like, I look at their expression and they mean it. I know that next time I'm not going to share with them. Or I write something and instead of giving me like maybe I'm looking for feedback, instead of giving me real feedback, the person is like basically talking down on this. I just like, even if it's subtle in a way I get it, so like that's, I've always sought sort of to preserve that space from which I create, which is, it's either like, it's appreciation or not. And so like, which I guess allows me then to enjoy the process of creation, because then I'm creating what I truly want, the way I want to create it. And so, yeah, it's always been that way, whether it's like the mode of telling a story or sort of the subject matter, or like, you know, the structure or whatever, but as well as sort of the you know, the things that are happening to the people, you know, whether the characters are going to be queer or not. I have always written towards like that place of utter enjoyment.
That's definitely communicated to this reader anyway. The stories are not problem or issue stories. There are problems and issues in them, but they don't feel constructed around the problem. You're recounting people's lives. Sex comes into the picture. It comes in different ways. It sometimes goes out and goes away in different ways. And it's part of the nature or texture of things, in my reading of the stories anyway. I think in a much less dramatic way that could be said about the way religion figures into the stories too. I mean, there's, just to pick two scenes, there's a scene of two boys exploring each other physically in the bathroom of the church. And then bookending that, 50 pages later, in the title story of the book, the young man who moves into the protagonist's house, bringing his keyboard because he's a church organist, is seen praying at the keyboard, and the protagonist watching this, his lover pray in front of the keyboard, is a beautiful and also a moment of desire for him. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, religion is, I guess, when we're editing the book, I remember my editor, one of my editors, because my Bridget and Megan worked together on it.
Bridget Hughes of Public Space Books and Megan.
Yeah, who was managing editor at the time. And so we discussed, so Bridget asked, how do you, like, you know, religion is sort of like a huge part of this book. And yet, like, we don't really, there aren't many scenes, I guess, where like characters go to church and stuff. So do you want it to like be, how do you want this? And I was like, I just want it to sort of be part of the atmosphere. And there are like quite a few moments where we do get in scene, and like this moment you sort of describe is one of those few moments, because there's, you know, there's prayer and then there's like the gaze of
love, really.
Yeah, right? And like he's watching Kamsi, and Kamsi is doing something private. At least to Kamsi, prayer is something private because he's praying quietly and he's using certain words, and he's doing it like after he has sung, like, and the, you know, the light and everything, and it's just like Lutanna being sort of attentive, I guess, in that very moment. And for me, it's sort of the feeling it conjures, you know, of, I guess, like when I think of the effects I want it to have on readers, it's like, you know, I want them to see that this character loves this person and is like looking at them attentively. And so these other characters are also doing something that is dear to them and something that is meaningful and intimate to them. And in that way, I guess, like, that's how, but the religious encounters are not always, you know, that beautiful. You know, there are times when it's like sort of kind of traumatic. There's a scene in Good Intentions where sort of it's just like the altar again, and then there's this character who has just had like a certain experience in church, and it's not as, you know, and it's not as calm and as that other situation. So yeah, religion does factor in several ways.
When we were in Brooklyn together, I think you told me that you wrote part of the book in the room of a church,
In the room of a church.
a borrowed room or something like that.
Oh.
No?
Oh no! A library. So like it's my secondary school library, St. Thomas Secondary School. So I wrote like a good number of it. What the singers say about love. I wrote while I was working there just before Iowa. That was when I wrote that story.
This is a story about two young men, and one of them becomes a pop star in Nigeria, and their relationship threatens to compromise his career. And it's a beautiful mix of classic, let's say, post-war literary fiction and popular culture. It really works. The title story of the book, God's Children Are Little Broken Things, which is the story that has the scene we've just discussed. One character looking with desire and love on another as he prays in front of his keyboard. That story is written in the second person. You do this, you do that. I guess it's a two-part question. What led you to use the second person in that story, first of all? Other writers, or just it was a technique that you hit on for yourself?
Yeah, I think with that story, that point of view just came.
You met in your second year.
Yeah, you met in your second year.
That's the opening line.
Yeah.
You get the idea that it puts us, the reader, in the shoes of the protagonist. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that story, I didn't have to think about it. I think like with both second person stories, I didn't really think of points of view that much. Although of course I had like a few false starts, as you know, as often is the case. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is not working, and with God's Children, like sometime, like once the story just came, and in fact the entire story I wrote like in a rush. And that was, yeah, there was no reasoning behind it, I guess.
That technique, so going back to like 1985, let's say, three of the best known pieces of contemporary fiction used it. Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney, and then Lust by Susan Minot, and then How to Date White Girl, Black Girl, Brown Girl, or Happy by Junot Diaz. All use this very aggressive second-person voice. So seeing you use it, I thought how ingenious it was to put the reader so definitely into the point of view of a queer character, that it took this technique, which I was familiar with from other books, and used it for this end of breaking down a boundary that I had never seen it used. I've never seen it used in that way before, where I'm invited you to identify as queer for the time it takes to read the story. Was that part of the design?
Yeah, but it's interesting that you would mention Junot Diaz. I've forgotten Miss Laura. I think Miss Laura is in the first person. I can't remember exactly, but I had read Miss Laura around the time, I was writing that particular story. And something about the voice, of Miss Laura, that story, like of the protagonist's or the narrator's voice, just quite intimate, like you say, and forceful and charged, and sort of active, I guess. I think also affected, sort of inspired and then another book I was reading at the time was Novelle Bulawayo's Bloom, We Need New Names. And it's like that voice, I guess like those stories kind of made me begin to think of voice or feel in my body, what voice the effects that kind of active voice can have. But then in writing the story, it's pared down, it's not as, aggressive, I guess. Because with Miss Laura, you hear the voice is an active thing in the room, and you're like, the sort of the diction, and well, with this, so it's like, yeah.
I find that teaching writing, which I do here at Georgetown, leads me to hazard very broad generalizations about what's going on in the literary world. One of the ones that I rely on, probably too much, is that younger writers, the preponderance of first-person writing, so many people write either fiction or personal nonfiction in the first person. So your book is much more in the third person or second person, and the combination of what you're describing accurately, I think, is an intimate voice with a less than intimate structure is powerful and works paradoxically. Is that part of the plan also? There's one story that's first person, but
yeah. So like with third person, it was mostly like what I wanted to do with language. I felt I could do it more with third person. I wanted to, like, I guess there was like that period where there was a period of time where I was just like, I want to have this freedom on the page, a certain kind of freedom, breath, like instead of language and space
lyricism,
and everything.
yeah.
Yes, and I was like, okay, the third person works for this. And then with the first person, I was, that story, I was going to start, I just knew I want to write this story in the first person. And I did, it was a bit, difficult thinking about it, because I was like, this is going to be one of the longest stories. I want to write something like immersive and that doesn't like jump across time, that goes like quite, linearly.
not all the stories do. Some of them hop around a fair bit.
Yes, and then it was like that first person story, and it was the only first person story there. But with the rest, I was like, I want to play here. I want to, and the third person allowed me that freedom.
I think the natural move here is to have, let's hear that voice. Will you read from one of the stories in the book?
All right. I'm going to read a bit from Happy is a Doing What. I don't know how long you want me to read.
You can kind of set it up and tell more or less what's going on.
Okay.
Story written in numbered sections, and
yes, and it's these two guys who it starts from childhood and ends in adulthood. At least the boys are around the age of maybe 24 or so when the story ends, and it begins when they are like probably 10 or not yet 10. And I'm going to read like a section and it's the story that you described a bit earlier, where sort of there's this sort of event in childhood where both boys kind of have a bit of discovery, but then a third boy comes in and kind of like,
which is one of the most, I learned from that story about the way power is used and the way anti-gay feeling is inflicted on people, in almost documentary fashion. I learned from that story.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Okay, that means I'm going to read from, a scene where he's now, one of the boys, Binyalum, I think, is now in Lagos. He didn't get admission into university, so he didn't study, he didn't like follow his dream of like going to university, and he goes to learn a trade in Lagos.
Which is what?
You said?
Trade. He goes
to learn a trade. Yes, he goes to learn a trade.
Which he says is for the dull students.
Yes.
In his view.
In his view, but then that's what he's doing now, and this is like the house of his boss. Sundays were for church and football. Oga Lawrence and Lady B did not approve of girlfriends, because to have a woman was to need money for dates and Valentine's Day and birthdays and shoes and handbags and shawarma. And to need money was to steal from Oga Lawrence's business. That was, however, not the speech they gave after morning devotion. Don't get a girl pregnant and derail your life, they said instead. Don't get a girl pregnant and derail your life, Innocent said, and they walked back groggily to the boys' quarters, rolling his eyes. as if they care about us. Binyelum laughed. In their room, he picked up his phone to find his father's missed calls. He called home every other evening to speak to the guys or to his mother and sisters, rarely ever to his father. "You never call your old man Bo," he said when Binyelum called back. He laughed, and maybe if he hadn't, the hurt wouldn't have stuck out so much, like a bone jutting out of torn skin. It made Binyelum queasy. "How about Daddy?" he said and laughed too. And then they both waited in silence. "Did you hear about Nnamdi?" his father asked. "Yes," Binyelum said. He had heard from his friends back home, from his sisters, from his mother. A 9-year-old girl had named Nnamdi as the reason she was injured down there, and her father, a retired army man, had stormed the street in a van load of soldiers, dragged Nnamdi into the middle of the street and beaten him until his eyes were onion purple, and then thrown him into the back of the van and driven away. "A shameful thing," his father said. "A shameful thing," Binyelum said. Binyelum agreed. They waited again in silence. "How is work?" his father said finally. Binyelum gazed out of the window at the milky Harmattan haze hovering over the conspiratorial cluster of roofs, at the people bright in their Sunday jeans and gele and abada, trudging up and down streets and alleyways, vibrant even in the cold, their noises of laughter and greetings rising and merging with the rumble and clatter of drums, with the brass songs and prayers blasting out of the speakers of the Mountain of Fire church down the road. It was so much like home, the riot of everything, the splattering of crumbling, brown-roof bungalows around that one compound ringed by flowers, the compound in which he now stood, looking out at all these people. Iya Ibeji, whose tomato grinding machine made so much noise, Baba Bolu, the police officer, Bolu, who always accosted Binyelum and the boys on their way from the shop, chanting, "Brother me," until Innocent handed him his PSP for the evening. Binyelum wanted to be the person looking down at everything from the house ringed by flowers. He wanted to be the person who, when his sister texted him saying there was nothing to eat at home, didn't immediately fall into a hole of depression and helplessness. He wanted to be the person who told others when they could date and when they could not. The plush couches in Oga Lawrence and Lady B's living room, the huge TV that started from the floor and rose nearly to the ceiling, the endless rows of Cerelac and Indomie noodles for the kids, the crates of eggs, the cornflakes. He wanted to have all that, a life of ease and plenty. Downstairs, Innocent was washing Oga's car, whistling to Osadebe, his arms, his bare back shining with sweat. Binyelum wished he could stay home, skip church today, but service was compulsory. If he were in Kano, he would be seated outside Mama Ayo's shop after football training, staring idly at the churchgoers. How he missed having nothing to do. I don't know if I should continue.
I think let's leave it there for the moment. I'm just so hearing it new in light of what you just said before you began to read, how your wish to work in the third person was to have greater range.
Yeah.
And that's a portrait in miniature of a whole sector of society done in a few sentences, with at street level, the different people working, the sounds and smells of a Sunday, the protagonist imagining how it looks from other points of view, such as from the windows, but also imagining the privation of the people who don't have enough to eat. So it's so many layers there. And that's, I mean, it's about half a page, really, of a small book. And so just how much you take in that small space is really striking. And that kind of, I don't want to say vindicates, but it illustrates that move in the third person and how much room you have when you write that way.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I really had fun writing that section. And sometimes I remember one of my teachers at Iowa, one of my earliest teachers at Iowa, Adam Haslett. I had written this story, Good Intentions. It was a different title at the time. And so it's part of what people said in workshop was and that's the thing with workshops sometimes, like, we can all move towards like one one point of view. Maybe if like someone who everybody's like, oh yeah, someone says something first, and then everybody sort of moves. So people are like, oh, like this is, yeah, the language is too lyrical and stuff. And Adam Haslett said something. He was like, whenever you're in that mood, and you find yourself, writing and like it's coming out of you that way, don't restrain yourself. Like do it, and you can always come back and like cut and stuff. And I think, hearing like things like that is quite, it's helpful, because sometimes you're like, oh, what they're saying, is it true? Do I have to pare down? And I remember with this particular story, I had written a part of it in Charles D'Ambrosio's class, his workshop, and part of the anxieties I had around like describing things was that I was like, oh, am I describing too much? Am I showing too much? And I was like, okay, I'm going to pare down. And I did this sort of, what is it called? Like even before workshop, I was just like assuming that was be the comment, that it was too much. And then he came to class. I think that was my final workshop, or the second to last workshop. And he at Iowa, and he was like, Arinze, this, you haven't really given us much by way of details. And that happens usually when, I didn't, I think when we're, he was, the story in a way is set on the street set on the street on which I grew. And so like I know these compounds familiarly. The situation is different, but like the places I described, right? And so I didn't feel the need like to sort of like overshow it. But he was like, yeah, it makes sense to you in your mind. It doesn't mean that it makes 100% sense to the people reading. And so like these are, I guess like we live in a culture that like, I guess, I don't know, but where we're being told that like things should be sort of streamlined into very like small, a certain kind of minimalism, right? I saw something on Twitter the other day where someone was like, what's happening to the street lights? The evolution of the street lamps from sort of this ornate and sort of wonderful things is, and it's like squares and like, and that's, I guess, for me, it was a way of like stylistic censorship that was happening, and then it was important to hear someone say, no, don't do that, yeah.
It's striking and disheartening to hear you say that, because so I went to the Columbia Writing Program in the early 90s, and it was the same thing. The whole struggle for me in that program was to go ahead and write it, instead of thinking that I should have it all work by implication. Mm-hmm. To go ahead and write it, and my books are 450 pages now. And so I had to climb out from under that in the same way that I guess people are still having to do that now.
Wow, that's interesting to hear.
I want to ask you what you're writing next, and also open the floor to questions. But as I do so, I'm just noting that, let's just say the last couple of days in the press, we've had one of the best-known writers dealing with Nigeria now, Teju Cole's new book is just out, and he's been interviewed and reviewed widely. And then one of the best-known queer writers, Justin Torres, his book, he was just written up in today's New York Times. So how does your work fit into your contemporaries, I guess, is maybe my indirect way of posing the question, what you're doing now.
Oh yeah, I don't know. So I usually, sometimes like when I'm asked that question, I'm like, I guess we're going to leave that question to the critics. You know what I mean? Like,
we put you all together and you're just doing your own thing.
Yeah, but right now I'm working on this novel where so there are like two main characters. Again, it's like that sort of shifting point of view. I'm kind of moving out of my comfort zone in the sense that like one of the protagonists is a Midwestern white man, and sometimes like sort of the hindrance is like, would a white man respond this way? I guess the answer is like, well, you know, a man who's cheating on his wife would respond this way, you know.
That's a transcultural that
yeah, I guess
responding.
Yeah, of doing like certain things. So like it's again. Yeah, so that's like what I'm working on, and so he's like in this relationship where, you know, with this boy, again, of course, it's not real because it's cheating. But the boy, like, so on the one hand there's that, and then on the other hand there's this young musician or music student who, you know, a composition major, and sort of his work and his life in this small Midwestern town. Yeah, it's been really exciting to get into it and to see and to work in this different. It's been a while. I guess the last time I wrote a novel was in secondary school. And right now,
you're writing a novel in secondary
it's in a novel. Yeah, it's fun, but some days it's like, you know. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello.
Being Nigerian and knowing how conservative the story is, I think it's really admirable that you haven't put any limitations on your creativity in terms of you write what you know and how you feel, and I just wanted to put it out there, and that's really admirable. And it's also, I think, a form of activism. It's very brave. The question I have, you answered it a little bit, but I wanted to go back to what you said in your opening remarks in terms of there seems to be two categories of writers, short story writers and novel writers. And so you partially answered, because I was going to ask, do you see yourself as a short story writer or a novelist? But it seems you're going into that genre now. So I guess another way to frame the question will be, how difficult or easy is the creative process for you in terms of switching, even though you wrote a novel way ahead of, but now it seems like the stakes are a lot higher. So how is the creative process for you? Are you banging your head on the wall a lot? Or are you just process?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I like I have days, you know, when I'm just like, yes, this is, you know, this is happening. And then I guess recently my cousin, I messaged her on WhatsApp, and I was like, so she I guess my step cousin, because like if people back home hear that like cousin, they'll be like, oh, your cousins are small, but this is my mom, my uncle's stepdaughter. She was like, I sent her like, I was like, I'm bored of this book. She was, but then I was like, oh yeah, but you know, with the collection also, there was a time where I was really bored and I got out of that. So I guess it's just part of the process. Maybe that's what happened when you're in the heart of a project, like in the right in the middle. And she was like, take a few days off. And then she sent me this meme that was so funny about like writers, and, you know, saying like, you know, the meme is like, this character is like working on my novel, and then the writer is like doing something else. And he's like, yeah, it's, yeah, so there are days when it's just, but but I think around those periods, it's like you're thinking without really, maybe sometimes you acknowledge it, sometimes you don't. There's also guilt, which you're like, I should be working, I should be writing 1,000 words a day, you know. But at the end of the day, before breakfast, and at the end of, but then, you know, sort of for me, like I have come to trust that if, as long as I wake up every morning and say, okay, these are the things I'm going to do today, and I give each one my best, and, you know, I put like the novel way up there. I give it my best, and some days I come with like 80%, 90%, and some days I come with like 40, 30, and that's fine. I have to remind myself of that. Thank you.
You mentioned that your first exposure to queer literature was when you were about 13. Do you think that your book is your intended audience to include younger readers in that, or even younger ages? And if so, have you tried, I mean, is it being distributed to school libraries, and do you get pushback on that?
So, so this is like the Nigerian edition, which just came out on the 16th. And so it's basically just coming out in Nigeria right now. And I hope I'm going to have that conversation. But I'm a bit like, I'm like, yeah, the subject matter, you know, and sort of not just the subject matter, but sort of there are like sins, sex sins, basically, you know, between men. And I don't know if they're going to, like, maybe not in secondary schools, because I'm like, maybe a miracle would happen and but like I know that like certain universities, when I was an undergrad in Nsukka, we had lecturers who would like, read Jude Dibia, we read like the writers of like the Beats movement, you know what I mean? Like, and it's, yeah, so like, but I don't know of secondary school, but I hope they, yeah.
Other questions? What am I leaving out? What have I, passed over altogether that you never get asked and always wish you did?
Me? I don't know. I think, yeah, not really, nothing. No, nothing.
Well, yes, of course.
The title, God's Children Are Unbroken Things, it's so fascinating and intriguing, and that was my introduction to your work. Where did that come from?
It just came, that title. I think there is something about it. Twice, editors try to advise me on sort of editing the title. The first time was, when I did the fellowship with the Public Space, the Imagine Writer Fellowship, and my mentor at the time was like, can we take away the little, because and he had like perfectly good reasons, and I thought about it and I was like, I don't like the way it sounds. God's children are broken things. No, that little, for me then at that time, it was a matter of sound, the rhythm. God's children are little broken things. It has to. So I wasn't even thinking of meaning at that time. I was just like sound. And then much later, when we're done with the book, Bridget, like we talked about like, what do I want? I was like, I want this book to sort of inspire hope in many ways. And Bridget was like, oh, if you want this book, and Bridget is my editor at a Public Space. Bridget was like, if you want this book to inspire hope, why then do you have like, it's just an editorial question. Why then like do we have God's children are little broken things? The idea of being broken. And then she proposed like a title, and I was like, I thought about the title, and I was like, I talked with a friend, and after a while I was like, no, I think, and that's the thing, like when I'm presented like with good options, I'm always like, but then so I was like, no, because I felt like, I would say you might regret this if you change the title, and I was like, yes, that's actually true, because I just love the sound, you know what I mean? God's children are little broken things, but then like it did make, and then sort of I sent her a note and I was like, hey, you see, the very idea that these characters, like, God, they are God's children, even in spite of like, the things they've been through and what the society has told them about themselves, and so a certain kind of like reclaiming of ownership, and to say, I have a God and I am a child of God. It doesn't, of course, not too literally, if you don't believe in that, but it's just something, At least I grew up in church, and even if I don't participate in sort of public religion or whatever, there are times where I feel maybe anxious, and prayer can be a thing of like sort of that helps with that anxiety. And so the fact that I am still able to do that, even after saying, oh my God, even after like certain experiences in church, to say yes, to claim, I think that's something that inspires hope, at least for me.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Because you said you would leave it to the critics to place you amongst your contemporaries, but for Black queer writing, like especially in Nigeria, is there a way you see a kind of movement forming between people like you, Kwaki and Menze, and others that at least offer something different than some of the kind of sometimes problematic stuff like that DJ has said about trans people, and so like, is there for you this kind of growing movement of Black queer and trans writers coming out of Nigeria at this particular time? Do you consider yourself to be part of that?
Yeah, I like to say that the future of Nigerian literature is queer, and in many ways, I think that like politically, socially, but also in terms of sensibility. And so like even when a writer is like perhaps not not queer in terms of like their lived experience, but sort of the, I have friends like who are heterosexual and cisgender in many ways, and then but people are just like, oh my God, this boy, are you sure you're not queer? But it's just the way they move in a way, and the things that that they love, and the way they see the world, I guess. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from this,
Thank you,
and
Paul.
I hope we get to keep having this conversation really for the rest of our lives. It's meant a lot to me to get to know you, and I'm so glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.